Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to discuss important concepts of goods and services tax. This is our first lesson in mathematics for ICSE 10th standard students. Each topic we will be covering in three parts. First part, concepts, where we will try to understand all the important concepts. In second part, we will discuss different types of problems on this topic. And in third part, we will discuss some tricky problems. Okay, so let's begin with goods and services tax, that is GST concepts. What is GST? Have you seen this GST tax? Yes, we have seen this in our various bills. Yes, whenever we are ordering something, we are buying something, in our bill, we see this GST with some percent, right? So, whenever any goods or service is sold, right, this GST is charged. GST is multi-stage tax. That means GST is charged at every stage of buying and selling. What does it mean? We will discuss this multi-stage tax in next slide. But this is destination based tax. This means the transaction of selling and buying, the location where this transaction takes place decides something about GST. Let's understand there are two types of sales: interstate sales and intrastate sales. What is interstate sales? When seller is in one state and buyer is in another state, from one state to another, across the states. This is called interstate sales. Intrastate sales, when seller and buyer are in the same state, within one state, right? So, depending on whether the sale is interstate or intrastate, the GST is classified in three types, right? First, state GST. What is state GST? It means the GST is paid to the state government. State government. Another next type of GST is central GST, which is paid to the central government. Now, state GST and central GST are charged in intrastate transaction, intrastate sale. So, when intrastate sales takes place, the GST is charged. Half part of it, half part of that amount goes to state government and half part of that GST goes to central government. It is divided between the GST paid on intrastate sales is divided into two half parts. One half goes to state government in the name of SGST, that is state GST, and the other half part goes to central government, that is called central GST, CGST. Now there is one third type of GST, that is integrated GST, IGST, which is charged on interstate sales across the state, right? And the whole amount goes to central government. Okay, so how GST is destination based tax? Because the tax we pay as GST, depending on the destination of buyer and seller, it decides whether that GST will go to state government or central government, right? That is why GST is destination based tax. Now we'll discuss this multi-stage tax in the next slide in detail to understand it better. Okay, now in basic unit, okay, when any sale happens, there is one seller and one buyer, right? Seller, you may take an example of a shopkeeper. He sells, right? He sells some products. We go to the shop, so we are buyer, right? And like as we go, there are many more people who are going to the shop and buying. So there are multiple buyers and one seller. It can be one seller, one buyer also. So how does GST works? Seller sells a product or a service to the buyer, right? And buyer pays to the seller the price of the product and service. In addition to that, buyer pays GST to the seller. That is why it is added in our bill. So all the buyers, whenever they are buying from a seller, along with the price of the product or service we are buying, we are paying GST to the seller, here to the shopkeeper, right? Now the seller collects the GST from its buyer and he is supposed to pay this collected GST to the government, respective government, right? So depending on which kind of sale it is, based on destination of buyer and seller. So if the sale is intrastate, then seller will pay the GST in two parts. One part will go to central government, one part will go to state government. If the sale is interstate, then the whole amount of GST collected from the buyer is paid to the central government. So seller pays the GST to the government, respective government. So seller collects the GST from buyer and pays to the government, right? Now let's see what we have learned so far. Buyer. Buyer pays GST to seller, right? Seller collects GST from buyer and pays to the government, respective government. Now, GST for buyer is always calculated on price after discount, if any. If you if you must have observed in the bill, GST is always some percentage of the final price you pay, right? So GST is always calculated on the final price to the buyer, right? After discount. If I am buying something, right, and I am getting it at 10% discount, right? So if the price of that I mean market price of that product is 100 rupees and I am getting 10% discount, that means I am getting the product at 90 rupees. Then the GST will be calculated on that 90 rupees, the final price charged to the buyer, right? So if there is no discount, that's fine. So whatever price the buyer is supposed to pay to the seller after discount, if at all there is a discount, the GST is charged on that amount, the final price to the buyer. Got it? Yeah. Now multi-stage scenario. What is multi-stage scenario? So we know there is a raw material supplier, right? Manufacturer needs raw material to manufacture some product. So manufacturer buys raw material from the supplier. So raw material supplier sells raw material to the manufacturer. Manufacturer manufactures some product and then it sells, the manufacturer sells the product, manufactured product to the wholesaler, right? Then wholesaler is a distributor for retailers, right? So wholesaler sells the product to the retailers, right? And the retailers sell the product to the consumer, right? So this is multi-staged. Multi-staged sell and buy goes on, right? So at each stage, now in this case, raw material supplier sells raw material to manufacturer. That means manufacturer is buying raw material from the raw material supplier. So buyer pays GST. So manufacturer pays price, whatever price it is being sold, plus GST. So manufacturer pays GST to the raw material supplier. Then wholesaler buys product from manufacturer, right? And buyer pays GST. So wholesaler pays GST depending on what price is for the product. The GST is paid to the manufacturer. Similarly, retailer buys product from wholesaler and pays GST to the wholesaler. Similarly, consumer buys product from the retailer, so consumer pays GST to retailer. So seller is collecting GST, right, everywhere. Please notice when the raw material is sold, manufacturer is buyer, right? When the product is sold to the wholesaler, in this transaction, manufacturer becomes seller and wholesaler is buyer, right? In this transaction, wholesaler sells product to retailer, retailer is buyer, and now wholesaler becomes seller, right? So for this transaction, manufacturer to wholesaler, wholesaler is a buyer, so it pays GST. And in this transaction, wholesaler to retailer, wholesaler becomes seller, right? So you understand who pays GST and how this multi-stage scenario occurs. This is just an example. You may have many more such examples in real life, right? So what is input GST and output GST? So the scenario which we discussed in last slide, we will take just part of it. Manufacturer sells product to wholesaler, wholesaler sells product to retailer, right? So now wholesaler is a buyer for manufacturer because it buys buys product, right? And wholesaler is a seller for retailer because it sells the product to the retailer, right? So buy means input and sell is output, right? So while buying, whatever GST is paid by the wholesaler, it's called input GST, right? And the GST which is collected from the retailer while selling the product is output GST for wholesaler, right? So input GST is paid and output GST is collected, right? Now, as we said, the seller collects GST from the buyer and pays it to government, right? But now, wholesaler is buyer for manufacturer and seller for retailer. So wholesaler is basically buyer as well as seller for different transactions, right? So while paying the GST to the government, wholesaler doesn't pay the whole output GST to the government. For wholesaler, the net GST to be paid to the government is its output GST, that is whatever he has collected from the retailer, minus input GST which he has already paid to the manufacturer, right? Because the product is same, right? It is buying, wholesaler is buying from manufacturer and selling it to the retailer. So while buying, if wholesaler has paid GST, that GST wholesaler is allowed to deduct from the output GST which he has collected. This is called net GST, right? Now we all know from manufacturer, when wholesaler buys product, it is at less price, right? Because wholesaler buys in a bulk, right? And we know that GST is calculated based on the final sales price, correct? So this final sales price when wholesaler is buying is definitely less than the final sales price when it is sold to the retailer, right? So when the product is sold to the retailer, the final sales price is more than at which wholesaler has bought the product, right? So definitely input GST is less than output GST, because here price is more, here price is less. So more GST, less GST. So net GST only wholesaler pays, right? And buy means input and sell is output. Input GST is paid and output GST is collected, and the difference is only paid to the respective governments, right? If the transactions, both the transactions are intrastate, then it go the net GST is half part goes to state government, half part goes to central government. Okay, so this is all about input GST and output GST. So what we learned, net GST is output GST collected minus input GST paid while buying, right? So how input GST is calculated? Input GST, when we are buying something, we are paying input GST. So our cost, final cost multiplied by rate of GST divided by 100, because it is in percent. Rate of GST is always in percent, right? And output GST, we are selling the selling price, that is final selling price multiplied by rate of GST divided by 100, right? And what we know, the net GST is selling price. Okay, when we net GST, we know that output GST minus input GST, right? So if we subtract these two equations, output GST minus input GST, so we are subtracting this from this, we get, now rate of GST divided by 100 is common for both, right? So we have taken it out, common for both. Okay, and we are remaining with sales price minus cost, correct? So sales price minus cost, what is it? It is profit. So net GST is calculated on the profit made, right? When the profit is made, when a person buys some product or services at less price and sells it at higher price, right? So this is net GST. Okay, so these are the important concepts of GST, right? If you understand these concepts clearly, it is very easy to solve the problems, right? So thank you for listening and watching this video. Do subscribe this channel and enable notifications, because now part 2 I will be posting soon, in which we will discuss different types of problems on GST. So we are going to cover each type of one problem of each type in detail, right? So don't miss it and keep learning. Happy learning. Thank you.